I recently read The War for Middle-earth by Joseph Loconte. I don't know if you can see that. I'll put a link in the description below because I do highly recommend this book. It was a great read. And so today I want to talk about that book, but to sort of set expectations, this isn't going to be a book review or a book summary. Rather, in the spirit of John Locke's quote about reading furnishing you with the materials for thinking, that's how I try to read. And so I read this book. It furnished me with a lot of materials for thinking. And I've just picked a couple of those that I want to share with you that we can talk about today. So we'll talk about things like the role and power of literature, the importance of historical context for understanding works of literature. We'll talk about decline narratives, eugenics, Hitler, things like that, war, as you might guess from the title. And if you hang around to the end, I'll give you a tip to make you a better reader, something I've been doing for a couple of years that's helped me a lot. With that being said, I do think it'll be helpful to start out with a sort of overview of the book, especially if you haven't read it, to give you a broad idea of what the book is about. And so essentially it is Tolkien, the subtitle is Tolkien and Lewis Confront the Gathering Storm, 1933 to 1945. And so what Joseph Loconte, who's a historian, what he does is he traces really how both of the world wars, there's an emphasis on the Second World War, but how Lewis and Tolkien's experience in the First World War and then the cultural conditions they found themselves leading up to the Second World War they found themselves in, how these motivate their writing and how they shape their imagination. And it's just a fantastic book. If you enjoy literature, if you enjoy history, this is a great threading of those two things together. And it was, just done very well. I liked it quite a bit. And so that's basically the idea. To give a little bit more detail, in between the wars, you have this acceleration of the modernist movement, certainly in literature, but other areas of culture. There's this broad sense of disillusionment, of moral and religious skepticism and cynicism. And so as things heat up going into the Second World War, Lewis and Tolkien, along with a group of their friends, wage their own sort of war, using their own gifts, using literature to combat some of the false ideas that are harming people in their country and in the world. And so they use literature in a really unique way. Some of the big takeaways for me personally, ways in which the book impacted me, first of all, it was very inspirational. It inspired me, got me to think about how I'm using my own unique gifts and interests and experiences and even suffering to help remind people of and point people to that which is true, good, and beautiful. And not being discouraged by the fact that I certainly can't do that in a way or a scale that Lewis or Tolkien did, but just being faithful with the opportunities that I do have. And so it inspired me to do that. It also was sort of further confirmation for the course of study that I've chosen, as right now I'm studying through the great works of literature, theology, history, philosophy, and seeing how invaluable those were for Lewis and Tolkien. Is just a confirmation that yes, this is worthwhile, certainly. And just as a quick side note on that, if you read something like The Lord of the Rings and you're like, this is different, this is so good, or The Chronicles of Narnia, for example, or Lewis's Space Trilogy, and you just sense something different, something so powerful and so alive in it, it's important to note, like, these didn't just come out of a vacuum. They didn't even pop out of the vacuum, the imaginative vacuum inside of the minds of these two geniuses. Rather, they come out of the Western tradition largely that these two authors were so deeply familiar with because they had read all of these great works, but not just read them, but taken them in. They'd really thought about them and not uncritically. And so you see how that comes in and then comes out in their works. And so it just kind of reaffirmed, this is really valuable. In fact, it's really essential for the kind of work that I'm wanting to do. I've got to be familiar with these, and it's not a duty or burden. It's something that is very enjoyable. It's something that I find joy in. But it just validated, this is a good way to spend time. And lastly, it just gave me an even greater appreciation for these two great men, Lewis and Tolkien, both some details on their personal lives, but especially these works of theirs. I will never again read these works the same way. It makes me think of a famous quote by, I think it was Heraclitus, who said something like, no man steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man. And certainly something like this is happening with reading, and this book had that sort of impact on me, where now as I read these works again, the next time I read The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or Lewis's Space Trilogy or Ransom Trilogy, it won't be the same. I will see and understand things that I missed the first time and have this greater appreciation for the works and what shaped them and what they were doing in their time and how that then matters in my time. So one of the things that the book really got me thinking about is decline narratives. Decline narratives, by which I mean roughly these narratives that capture our thinking and imagination on an individual level or societal level, that things are in decline, that there's moral decline, that things are falling apart socially, our institutions may be crumbling, that the end of the world or the end of the Western world we're at the brink of that. I see this a lot, at least in the U.S., coming up on election cycles. Every election cycle, this is the one. If this one doesn't go, the right way, it's going to be the end. And you hear this sentiment on both sides, which is interesting. But these kind of decline narratives, just that things are on the brink of falling apart, that things are declining, that things are coming down morally, societally, institutionally, and so on. This book really got me thinking about those, and there's some really valuable lessons I think we can learn from the book and from history and literature more broadly. One of the reasons that they're particularly relevant in this book is because it covers a lot of this period between the world wars, and if you know anything about that period, it is characterized to a large degree by these debates, by these discussions over the decline of Western civilization, and this fear that, in fact, Western civilization is about to break, that it is about to come to an end, maybe civilization in general. There's a lot of anxiety over this in the narratives that were being spread and discussed at the time. And so this book reminds us of that, but it's important, and I'll come back to this later, I think. If you think about decline narratives, they are pretty much a fixture. They ebb and flow a bit, but if you read through history, it is very common that people have this sense that things are falling apart, things are about to break. And there's a reason for that, I think, multiple reasons. But one in particular, maybe I'll come back to in a minute. To help us understand and appreciate the importance of decline narratives, how we should do them, but how we should do them cautiously or with care, I want to give you an image of a ship. I might make you think of Plato's Republic, but this will be a different ship, a different image. This is an image of a sinking ship, and so we have on the one hand this ship that's sinking. There's people on it, so that's not good. And people notice it, and they start calling attention to it. Now, that's a good thing. You don't want people just running around having a great time. The ship is sinking, and no one cares. No one seems to notice. That would be awful. So it's good that people notice, hey, something's declining, something's going wrong, there's water coming in. So we need people to call attention to that. But on this sinking ship, things go wrong because the people who are calling attention to it don't do it carefully. They do it a little bit carelessly, maybe a little bit excessively, and in the wrong way, and it leads to some really negative outcomes. And so they start going around telling everyone, the ship is sinking, this ship is going to sink, and there's nothing we can do about it. This ship is going down. We're on the brink of the whole thing imploding. What do you think people start doing on that ship? Well, you have some people that start jumping overboard, rather than die in an hour from now when the ship goes under, I'll just go ahead and end it now. So you have people who jump overboard. You may have people who start breaking the ship down. There's this great vessel, this beautiful ship. They start breaking it apart to build weaker vessels that are sort of promises of salvation, that, hey, this big ship's going down, let's make our own. So they start tearing it down, they start destroying it so that they can make these weaker vessels, and then people get in those. But those weaker vessels, they can't do what the big ship was doing. And so they get in the water, and those people who went into them for salvation end up sinking. They end up perishing or having great ruin. That's a tragic way for this in which this can end. Other people maybe just to start destroying the ship out of hatred for the ship itself. The ship is sinking. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. And so they start tearing it apart with no idea of rebuilding, with no idea of what the fact that they're destroying the very thing, the only thing that's holding them up. And so you can see the seriousness of the way in which this decline narrative spreads throughout the ship, and people lose their minds sort of and start doing things that really aren't rational, things that certainly are not in line with what is true, that aren't leading to goodness and beauty, but lead to ruin in the end. Even if the intentions in the beginning were good, because people notice, hey, things aren't right, we need to call attention to that, which is in general a good thing. I'll say this too, this isn't just something theoretical. I give an image of a ship. I talk about how this is a big deal in between the world wars. It's a big deal now. I think everyone probably has a sense of that. We have a sense that things are in different areas, in different ways, falling apart or crumbling. There's this social anxiety, there's political division and polarization and isolation and all these negative trends, right? And so it's really easy to have these decline narratives be spread around. And again, my point isn't that we should ignore these things. They're important. We need to call attention to them, but we need to be really cautious. We need to be really careful in the way we do that. And I think about in my own life, a young girl my wife and I talked to a couple of years ago, who expressed this sentiment just in conversation that, well, why care? Why finish school? Why do anything? The world's going to fall apart anyway. This sort of nihilistic, fatalistic view of the world. And this is what, if we're not careful, people will hear, especially young people, but people of all ages. And so that's good general advice. We need to be careful with decline narratives, but I want to give a little bit more information, a little bit more context. And Lewis and Tolkien teach us some of this, and Loconte does a good job of pulling that out, drawing that out in his book. When you come across decline narratives, as you hear them and begin to think about them, or before you start promoting them yourself, here's some things I want to give you to think about. First of all, like I mentioned earlier, decline narratives ebb and flow throughout history, but they are more or less perennial. This has always been the case. There's always been this sense that things are falling apart. And we should pay attention to those, but we should do so with caution, because they're not without warrant. It's not the case that, people have always thought things were falling apart, but they were always wrong. Well, no, they were actually right. Things have been falling apart. In a way, things are always falling apart. There's a great quote in the book where Winston Churchill says, "What a slender thread the greatest of things can hang by." The greatest of things are often hanging by a slender thread. The true, the good, the beautiful, these things always need protection. They always need maintenance. They always need preservation. Like, you think like a beautiful garden, it needs to be tended to, or weeds will creep in, animals will come in and destroy it. It's always at risk. And so yes, we do need to call attention to it. We do need to think about it. The threat is always there. Sometimes the attack or the threat is more intense. Sometimes the threat is in the foreground. Sometimes it's in the background. I think sometimes I would prefer it to be in the foreground. When it's in the background, we tend to get kind of comfortable and slack, and it can do more harm more slowly. So sometimes maybe we should be thankful that it's in the foreground, but the threat is there. So if we feel that sense, yeah, we're probably not wrong completely. There's something there. This theme emerges really powerfully in the Lord of the Rings trilogy by Tolkien. And once you understand the historical context, it makes perfect sense why it does. But I want to call attention to one particular thing from the Return of the King. This is where Denethor, the steward of Gondor, is in a moment of despair before he tries to kill himself and his son. He says these 4 words: "The West has failed. The West has failed. It's over. It's done." He says it's time for all to depart who would not be slaves. Here's Gandalf's reply: "Such counsels will make the enemy's victory certain indeed." Yes, if you give up, if you say, yes, it's over, well, then it's over because you've said it is, because you've given up. The only people who could have stopped it, instead of trying to, have failed in doing so. We have to be careful that we don't let that seep in our own hearts and our own minds, and that the way in which we talk about decline narratives, that we don't cause other people to fall into that kind of despair. I think about later on in The Return of the King, just shortly after that, the chapter, the last debate, where Gandalf and the company are debating what's their next course of action. They've just had a victory at Gondor, but now the forces of the East are coming in, and it looks like there's no way for them to prevail. And in that moment, Gandalf is realistic. He tells them that this war then is without final hope, as Denethor perceived. He tells them to pay attention to what Denethor said. Denethor had seen some things in this ball or orb, and he tells them there's weight to that. We need to stop and think about it and take it into account. We're not trying to deny the things that are going wrong or going bad. And Gandalf is so bold as to say this war then is without final hope. And then he says, so what prudence would counsel you to do is to go back to the places where you can survive the longest. You're not going to win the war, but go fight where you can to survive as long as you can. And the company is sort of astonished by this. And then Gandalf says, well, I said this would be prudent, but I don't counsel prudence. I said victory could not be achieved by arms. I still hope for victory, but not by arms, not by military force or might. And then comes a little bit later this famous quote by Gandalf, which I'll briefly read. Yet it is not our part to master the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule. Our purpose is to be faithful with the opportunities that we have, to fight in the time and the place that we are planted with the tools that we have to do that. But what Gandalf appeals to is a higher moral standard. What Gandalf says essentially is to do what's right, regardless of the outcome. That we don't just look, well, how can we win? But how can we do what is right, whether we perceive that there's hope or not? If you read The Lord of the Rings with this in mind, this idea of decline narratives and how Tolkien blends those into the tale and the response, both good and bad to it. There's so much that we can learn from it. We can also learn from the decline narratives in post-World War I, the decline narratives that sort of amped up or accelerated after the First World War. I want to read you a quote from Loconte's book. He talks about how Richard Overy, in his book In the Twilight Years, The Paradox of Britain Between the Wars, Overy argues that the popular theories of impending decline and collapse influenced nearly all cultural activities, intellectual, artistic, literary, scientific, and philosophical. What Overy's getting at here is that these decline narratives really matter. They really can come to influence all of our culture, our intellectual centers, our centers for art and thinking and philosophy. All of this can get colored by these. So we really, again, need to pay attention to this. And what ends up happening post-World War I is, one of the things is that it begins making people desperate for a solution. As something like anxiety and panic begins to set in, that the ship is sinking, people start becoming desperate for solutions. And when people are desperate for solutions, they're more likely to be deceived by people who come along with a wonderful vision for the future. Oh, here's how everything will be totally fine. No matter how dark the road to get there, there's this bright light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah, we have to do some things first, but it's going to rescue us from what would be total destruction and ruin. And this is what primes people for the totalitarian regimes that take off in Germany and Italy and Russia and Japan. And also primes them for the rise of eugenics, which we'll get to in just a minute and talk a little bit more about. And so you see how these narratives can really impact people and set them up for adopting some really, really bad alternatives. They would have been better off actually staying on the ship than getting in these weaker vessels to return to our image of the ship. And as Loconte points out, Lewis and Tolkien, and this is where we can learn from them, Lewis and Tolkien reject the disillusionment. They reject the despair and the fatalism, but not by turning a blind eye to the problems, not by saying, well, no, everything's totally fine, or stop talking, it's not so bad. They understood the weight of how bad it was. But instead of giving up, they fought back. And these, especially coming to the Second World War, they didn't fight back by trying to re-enlist in the military at in their 40s. Rather, they used their position, where they were at, and their skills to fight back in a very unique and what ended up being a very powerful way in their literature. One thing that, again, Loconte draws attention to is how much impact their literature had, how much the works of these two men, and again, those in their circle, but especially these two, had on the culture, how they were a staying force to help prevent the complete collapse of moral realism and these traditions that have kept the West going for a couple millennia. And they did this largely by embracing what lie in these storehouses of the Western tradition, in these great works of literature. For Tolkien, the courage in Beowulf, for Lewis, Virgil's Aeneid, and many other works, but these two in particular, as Loconte tells us, these were critical works for both of these thinkers. But they draw on that wealth. They stand on the shoulders of giants instead of just trying to make it up themselves or find their own solutions from scratch. And we can certainly learn from that as well. This is one reason that we need to read those great works. We need to be familiar with the history, with the literature, with the philosophy, with the theology from the past that has brought us to where we are today. And in doing this, they did a great service to us because they left us with these phenomenal works that we can continue to read today, that we can continue to draw from, these works that have become part of that great conversation that we can enter into. But they've also set a great example for us because someone needs to pick up this baton. Someone needs to carry the torch. We can't just live off of the things from the past. We need to be creating new great works today and doing new things in our time that draw from the rich wealth that they and so many others have left for us. So a minute ago, I mentioned that the post-World War I decline narratives helped to spur on this eugenics movement in a real sense. So I want to talk for a minute about eugenics. Maybe this is because of my sort of unique and not a great way educational background, but somehow I made it through high school and college without ever, as far as I can remember, even hearing the term eugenics. I had no idea about this movement or our participation in it in the United States. And to me, that is just so bizarre. And this is something that absolutely needs to be taught. We need to know this part of our history, how it happened, and what changed it. As Loconte reminds us, it's hard to overstate the degree to which eugenics captured the imagination of medical and scientific communities in the 1920s and 1930s. eugenics societies were supported by Nobel Prize-winning scientists. This wasn't some fringe side movement that got a little bit of traction. This was something supported, praised by top intellectuals, top scientists. This is a movement that became a global movement. Even right before the First World War, you have this Congress, an international Congress or global Congress on eugenics in a positive way. But after World War I, 24 of what was at the time 48 states in the United States passed sterilization laws. 24 states. The U.S. Supreme Court in Buck versus Bell upheld the legality of these kinds of laws. The U.S., broadly speaking, was on board with eugenics. And something that this book gave me a greater appreciation for and understanding of that I didn't have previously is how the world wars impacted eugenics. It was certainly a movement long before World War I. It was even gaining some traction going into the beginning of the 20th century, at the start of the 20th century. But without a doubt, World War I had a significant boosting impact. It significantly accelerated the adopting of eugenics practices and ideologies, the furthering of those. So World War I, in a way, ignites this fire around eugenics. And then World War II is what ends up dousing that fire as humanity sees the destination. They see where this leads to, where it can lead to. Many were so shocked by the horrors of World War II, in particular Nazi Germany, that eugenics was no longer the respectable, praiseworthy thing it had once been. Now, to be clear, it didn't just go away. It certainly isn't the case that right after World War I, it was gone. I think it was the Netherlands that had sterilization practices through 1975. There were ongoing practices and people who continued to praise it post-World War I. But in general, we had a shift in our attitude towards it. And this got me thinking, had it not been for World War II, which was a fast, massive, shocking failure, failure is not really the right word, maybe a success of the eugenics movement, that showed us the horrible realities behind some of the otherwise soothing language of people at the time who were promoting it. When we saw that, people pumped the brakes. But imagine that hadn't happened. Imagine there was no World War II. What would be going on with eugenics today? I suspect it might have a similar status to something like abortion, where there's a large group of people, maybe in the US, roughly half the population, that's very uncomfortable with it, has moral objections, and the other half who roughly isn't, or not as much. Obviously, there's a variety of views there. I suspect it might be something like that. Had we not been faced with that horror, because it was mounting, again, this was something defended by some of the greatly respected and influential intellectuals of the day in the 20s and 30s and even very early 40s. What would have stopped that? We think, oh no, eugenics is awful. I would never. Really? I'm not so sure. And so, in a way, I think World War II potentially put a stop to that. Counterfactuals with history are always tough. What would have happened? But this got me thinking that what would have happened had it not been for World War II? And it's not at all clear to me, at least, that we wouldn't still be doing eugenics on some pretty significant scale, at least here in the States and other areas in the West and Europe. So speaking of eugenics, let's talk about Hitler. And in particular, I want to call attention to this striking similarity between Hitler and Saruman in The Lord of the Rings that jumped out at me as I was reading something I'd never heard of before, but came across in Loconte's book. This is where Hitler is giving this speech. It's June of 1940. He gives a speech to the Reichstag, and it's broadcast internationally. It's broadcast on the BBC in English, translated into English, and C.S. Lewis is listening to it. And he writes afterwards to his brother, and this is how he describes the effect, this almost hypnotic effect. He says, "I don't know if I am weaker than other people, but it is a positive revelation to me that while the speech lasts, it is impossible not to waver just a little. Statements which I know to be untrue all but convince me, at any rate for the moment, if only the man says them unflinchingly." As I read this, my mind went immediately to this scene from The Lord of the Rings where Saruman is in the Orthanc Tower at Isengard, and Gandalf has come to confront him. He's trapped in there. Gandalf's come to talk to him, and he's brought some other people with him, some other strong and wise people that are with him. And as Tolkien describes what happens when Saruman speaks, it is, chillingly similar to what Lewis described. As he speaks, while he speaks at least, people can't help but be moved a little bit. People who know otherwise, they know that they know the things that he's saying, they know to be false. And yet as he says them, they seem so true. And so this was just a really interesting connection based on the timeline of when Tolkien was writing. I don't think it lines up where I don't think that Lewis had heard that speech and shared it before Tolkien had written that part of the Lord of the Rings. But wow, the similarity is striking. But more importantly, I think it's a really important reminder for us today. It reminds me of this: let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. We think that we're pretty immune to deception and deceit. Well, we would never fall for something like that. Maybe me in particular, us in general as a society, we would never do something like what the people did in World War II. So many people falling for these totalitarian visions, for example. But we're probably a lot more vulnerable than we think. And in fact, if we don't think we're vulnerable, that may be the very thing that makes us vulnerable. So we must be always on guard, always vigilant. So one last thing, I want to leave you with a tip for reading, something that will help you be a better reader and get more out of your reading, enjoy it more, something that I wish I had started doing sooner, but I've been doing for maybe a couple of years now. But before I do that, if you've enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe so that you can see more content like this. I'll be doing other different things, but other content that's similar as well. And if you have any thoughts on what I've talked about today, the decline narratives that we're in today, or things from World War II, or Lewis and Tolkien, things that you love in them, leave that in the comments below as well. So the tip is really simple. It's to build your own personal bibliography, a bibliography of books that you want to read in the future. And one of the best ways to do this is to pick up on it as you're reading books. They are sort of these seeds that let you know, like future trails that you can go down, essentially. So one way that I'll do that is, as I'm reading, if I come across a quote from something or something in the text that comes from a book that sounds interesting, I will always put the same symbol. I don't know if you can see this, a circle with an R with a circle around it. So let me know that I want to come back to that and read it. Then at the end of the book, I can flip through and pick those out. For nonfiction books like this one, where the author has done you the favor of putting together a bibliography, it's a little bit easier. I'll also just go through the bibliography at the end and highlight anything that I want to read out of there. And then I take those, though, and put them in a list, right? Because if I just highlight them in here or mark them in here, then it's going to sort of die with this book when I put it back on the bookshelf, at least for the time being. So I take those and I put them, for me, into an electronic format where I can keep adding this list in alphabetical order and so on. But that's really, really helpful. So I'd encourage you to keep those in one place. I'll actually be publishing my bibliography as it is today and probably updating that on my Substack. There'll be a link to that in the description as well. So feel free to check that out. And again, if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.